25th of March, 1945. Ashdown Forest, Sussex. Deep beneath the rolling hills and ancient woodlands, 60 meters of reinforced concrete separate the surface world from a chamber that holds Britain's most powerful weapon. Not a bomb, not a gun, a transmitter. 3 enormous antenna masts pierce the canopy above, their steel frames stretching 110 meters into the grey English sky, pointing like accusing fingers towards Berlin. Inside the underground bunker, the air thrums with a deep, almost subsonic vibration. 12 massive valves, each capable of dissipating 40 kilowatts of heat, glow with an eerie blue-white light. Water courses through cooling channels. The Crossley Premier diesel engines hammer away, their 16 cylinders generating enough power to light a small town. Engineers in shirt sleeves monitor dials and adjust controls with practiced precision. Tonight, they will do something unprecedented in the history of warfare. They will steal a German voice. At precisely 2100 hours, a Luftwaffe pilot climbing into darkness above the Ruhr receives his instructions. The voice in his headphones sounds familiar, authoritative, unmistakably German. It tells him to vector northwest, to an altitude of 6,000 meters, to intercept a bomber formation approaching from the channel. He banks his aircraft accordingly. The orders are crisp, professional, indistinguishable from those he's followed 100 times before. Except tonight, that voice isn't coming from a German ground controller. It's coming from Sussex, from a transmitter codenamed Aspidistra, and every word is a lie designed to send him precisely where no bombers will be found. This is the story of how Britain turned Germany's own radio network into an instrument of confusion, deception, and psychological warfare. And it worked because the Germans could never be entirely certain which voice was real. The problem that demanded Aspidistra's creation was brutally simple. By 1940, Nazi Germany had constructed one of the most sophisticated propaganda machines in human history. Joseph Goebbels understood what he called the 8th great power of radio broadcasting. The Volksempfänger, the People's Radio, sat in millions of German homes, a deliberate tool of indoctrination produced cheaply to ensure maximum penetration. German military broadcasts coordinated defensive operations across occupied Europe. Night fighters received vectors from ground stations. U-boats took orders via powerful transmitters. The entire Reich operated within an information ecosystem the Nazis controlled absolutely. Britain's existing countermeasures proved woefully inadequate. The BBC could broadcast to Germany, certainly, but listeners knew it was the enemy. The penalty for listening to a fine sender, an enemy station, ranged from imprisonment to execution. Even those brave enough to tune in recognized British programming immediately. What intelligence services desperately needed was something more insidious. They needed to become the enemy. To speak with German voices, on German frequencies, using German call signs, embedded within German broadcasts so seamlessly that listeners wouldn't recognize the deception until the poison had already worked its way into their minds. Traditional jamming offered no solution. Overwhelming a German station with noise would simply alert everyone that the broadcast was under attack. The Germans would change frequencies, alter procedures, warn their forces. No, what was required was something far more subtle. A way to hijack the German network, not by silencing it, but by becoming it. To insert false information that seemed to originate from trusted sources. To whisper doubt and confusion directly into the ears of soldiers, sailors, and civilians who believed they were hearing their own people. The technical requirements seemed impossible. The transmitter would need power enough to overpower German stations across occupied Europe. It would need the ability to change frequency rapidly, something medium-wave transmitters simply couldn't do, and it would need to be built, installed, and operated in absolute secrecy, whilst Britain fought for its very survival. The solution began not in Britain, but America. In 1932, an entrepreneur named Powell Crosley Jr. conceived of a radio transmitter unlike any built before. 500 kilowatts of raw broadcasting power, 10 times stronger than any station in the United States. RCA designed and built the monster for Crosley's WJZ station in Newark, New Jersey. By May 1934, it was on the air, reaching half of America after dark, commanding advertising rates of $1,200 per minute. Then the Federal Communications Commission, pressured by furious competitors, imposed a 50-kilowatt power limit on all American stations. RCA's magnificent transmitter became worthless overnight, except to someone who didn't operate under American regulations. Britain's Secret Intelligence Service purchased the transmitter for £165,000 in 1941. Harold Robin, an engineer of exceptional skill and determination, received orders to install and commission it with great urgency. The location chosen was King's Standing, near Crowborough in East Sussex, elevated 195 meters above sea level on Ashdown Forest. Here, Canadian Army engineers excavated a bunker 15 meters deep. The Art Deco transmitter building went underground, protected by 4 feet of reinforced concrete, then soil and fast-growing trees. 3 antenna masts, each 110 meters tall, rose above the concealment. When completed, the installation looked like nothing more than a radio relay station, unremarkable to German reconnaissance aircraft that occasionally passed overhead. The transmitter itself was a masterpiece of American engineering adapted to British purposes. RCA's design used 3 Class B modulators, running in parallel, each feeding its own 170-kilowatt power amplifier. Together, they generated 600 kilowatts of output power, channeled through a 100-ohm coaxial line to the main antenna mast. The other 2 masts operated as parasitic elements, creating a directional beam aimed eastward, towards occupied Europe and Germany beyond. At the heart of each amplifier sat 4 GL898 valves, water-cooled triodes using a 3-phase heater supply. These weren't small components. Each valve could dissipate 40 kilowatts of heat. Cooling water flowed continuously through channels in the valve casings. The combined heat output of the 12 power amplifier valves alone equaled that of a medium-sized industrial furnace. Power came from 2 Crosley Premier heavy oil engines, flat 8-cylinder units fitted with blown superchargers, driving a single flywheel alternator rated at 3,190 horsepower. The local electricity grid couldn't supply sufficient current for Aspidistra's demands, so the installation generated its own power. When the engines ran, the ground vibrated for meters around. Inside the bunker, the noise was physically punishing. Engineers wore hearing protection and worked in shifts, but here was Aspidistra's crucial innovation. Most medium-wave transmitters of the era operated on a single fixed frequency throughout their service life. Changing frequency required hours of work, retuning multiple circuits, adjusting antenna-matching networks. Aspidistra could retune in minutes. This capability, unusual to the point of being revolutionary, would prove essential to its wartime role. On the 8th of November 1942, Aspidistra came online. Initial operations fell under joint control: the political warfare, executive for propaganda, the BBC for broadcasting, the RAF for military deception. Sefton Delmer, a British journalist of Australian heritage who'd spent his youth in Berlin and spoke German like a native, directed the propaganda operations. Delmer had interviewed Hitler in 1931, traveled with the Nazi leader during the 1932 elections, witnessed the Reichstag fire investigation. The Nazis simultaneously suspected him of working for M16 and considered him sympathetic to their cause. Both assumptions were wrong, but Delmer understood the Nazi mind better than almost any Englishman alive. He brought that understanding to Aspidistra. Delmer's first major success was Soldatensender Calais, supposedly a German military radio station in France. programs originated from a purpose-built studio at Milton Bryan in Bedfordshire, connected to Aspidistra by high-quality telephone lines. The programming formula was brilliantly simple. Cover, cover, dirt, cover, dirt. Good music, sports results, weather reports. Everything a German soldier wanted to hear, mixed with carefully crafted propaganda designed to erode morale. Rumors about wives sleeping with foreign workers back home. Warnings about corrupt Nazi officials, hints that certain units were being sacrificed whilst party members stayed safe. The station never pretended to be official Nazi broadcasting, but soldiers listened anyway. If caught, they could claim they thought it was legitimate German radio. Even knowing it was British, many trusted it more than Goebbels' broadcasts. Starting in 1943, Aspidistra took on a more aggressive role. Operation Dartboard targeted German night fighter operations during RAF Bomber Command's strategic offensive. German radar stations broadcast the movements of Allied bomber streams, directing night fighters to intercept. British operators, fluent in German and trained in proper radio procedure, listened to these broadcasts continuously. When they heard German controllers giving vectors, they jumped in with their own transmissions. The confusion was immediate and devastating. A pilot receiving conflicting instructions couldn't know which voice was real. Send him to the wrong sector and he'd waste fuel searching empty sky. Direct him to land and he'd be out of the battle entirely. When the Germans switched to female controllers to counter the impersonation, Britain recruited German-speaking members of the Women's Royal Naval Service and continued the deception. But Aspidistra's most audacious operations began on 25th of March, 1945, as Allied forces pushed deep into Germany. The intrusion operations exploited a vulnerability in the German broadcasting network. During air raids, stations in target areas shut down to prevent bombers using their transmissions for radio direction finding. However, most German stations were networked, broadcasting identical content. When a station went silent, Aspidistra would begin transmitting on its frequency. Initially, it simply relayed the German network broadcast received from stations still operating. German listeners heard no interruption. Their local station seemed to be functioning normally. Then, smoothly, the British operators would begin inserting false content into the broadcast. The first intrusion occurred on the night of 25th March, 1945. On 30th March, Aspidistra hijacked the Berlin and Hamburg stations, broadcasting a warning that the Allies were spreading confusion by sending false telephone messages from occupied towns to unoccupied areas. The irony was exquisite. On the 8th of April, the Hamburg and Leipzig frequencies carried warnings about forged banknotes in circulation. On the 9th of April, announcements encouraged civilians to evacuate to 7 bomb-free zones in central and southern Germany. All of the announcements were false. All appeared to come from official German sources. German authorities quickly realized what was happening and issued their own warnings. The enemy is broadcasting counterfeit instructions on our frequencies. But how could they convince people to ignore official-sounding broadcasts on official frequencies? The resulting confusion was, in the assessment of one German official, causing considerable misunderstandings and great unrest among the population. Germany had nothing comparable to Aspidistra. Their Goliath transmitter was more powerful, true, but it was used exclusively for radiotelegraphy communications with U-boats, not broadcasting. No German station could match Aspidistra's combination of power and frequency agility. The Nazis had built an information system designed to control their population. They never anticipated someone would hijack it from the outside. The Americans operated similar programs, but nothing with Aspidistra's sophistication. Radio 1212 provided a comparable service to American forces, yet it lacked the power to truly impersonate German domestic broadcasting. Only Britain had both the technical capability and the psychological warfare expertise to make the deception seamless. Assessing Aspidistra's impact requires acknowledging what we can verify and what remains uncertain. Quantifying psychological warfare is notoriously difficult. We know German commanders warned their units to ignore suspicious broadcasts, describing them as dangerous to morale. We know Allied intelligence intercepted German messages expressing frustration and confusion. We know that many German soldiers later admitted they'd regularly listened to Soldatensender Calais, finding it more entertaining and often more credible than official Nazi programming. Whether this translated into measurable degradation of German military effectiveness is harder to determine. Night fighters sent to wrong locations certainly didn't intercept bombers. Civilians who evacuated to non-existent safe zones created refugee problems that strained German resources. The cumulative effect of doubt, confusion, and mistrust in official communications had value, even if we cannot assign it a precise numerical measure. After the war, Aspidistra continued operating until the 28th of September 1982, used exclusively by the BBC for external service broadcasts to Europe. Harold Robin, the engineer who'd installed the transmitter 40 years earlier, had the honor of switching it off for the final time. The installation was dismantled in 1984. Several GL 898 valves and one of the 3 massive RF output coupling coils were saved by Foreign and Commonwealth Office engineers and placed on display at the Orfordness Transmitting Station in Suffolk. A small plaque explains their origin. The underground bunker was repurposed as one of 17 sites designated for government use in the event of nuclear war. Later, Sussex police used portions of the facility. Today, only those few preserved components remain of the machine that once projected British deception across occupied Europe. Return to that night in March 1945. Return to that Luftwaffe pilot, circling in darkness, listening to voices he trusted because they sounded like his own people, speaking his language, using his procedures. He doesn't know that 60 meters beneath an English forest, engineers are watching dials and adjusting frequencies. He doesn't know that the voice in his headphones originated in Milton Bryan, traveled down telephone lines to Sussex, and erupted from antenna masts with enough power to overwhelm every German transmitter within range. He only knows what he hears, and what he hears sounds real. That was Aspidistra's genius, not the engineering, remarkable as it was. Not the 600 kilowatts of power, or the rapid frequency changing, or the directional antennas. The genius was understanding that the most effective deception is the one that sounds exactly like truth. Germany built a system designed to control information. Britain turned that system against itself, whispering lies that sounded like orders, broadcasting confusion that seemed like news, creating doubt in the one thing an authoritarian state cannot tolerate: uncertainty about which voice speaks with authority. In the history of electronic warfare, few weapons have been as elegantly conceived or as ruthlessly effective. The Germans could hear it. They could warn against it, but they could never be entirely certain, listening to their own radios, whether the voice they heard was truly their own.